Welcome, everyone, to Classic Amateurs. My name is Norman, and I'm here with Raz. How are you, Raz, today?
Fantastic, Norm. I have to admit, I am on holiday in Europe. I'm in the south of France, just somewhere in the middle of nowhere in a village, taking in the sweet scent of lavender. Unfortunately,
Mm,
we arrived after everything's been harvested, so we can't really enjoy those wonderful views of the lavender. We can still feel the smells.
the memory of lavender.
I admit that when I planned the trip, I was still hoping for some strands, some of lavender to be
Some
available.
lavender, yeah.
No.
Cool, awesome.
How are you
So,
feeling today, by the way? Yeah.
I'm good. I'm fine. I have returned home, well, in Hungary for now, and we'll be traveling back to Sydney next month. Everything is fine. Early morning wake ups. I drink my familiar coffee. I throw around and try to find my familiar socks. I complain about the familiar weather. Just the usual. Yeah.
Typical Hungarian aches,
We
pain
love to
points.
talk about the weather and our missing socks. All right. Today we suggested to talk about a little bit of fantasy from last week's hard economics topics. We might move into like something more entertaining. Our suggestion, or what we agreed on, is I'll talk about Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, and you'll compare that or contrast it with J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit, which is, I believe, the prequel to Lord of the Rings, correct?
That's right.
Cool. Awesome.
Maybe we should jump into Hobbit because it's such a classical structure in a way of many elements that we've covered before when we spoke about, say, mythology and so on. So maybe that's a
Mhm.
great way to start. And then we can contrast that with the twists of Game of Thrones, right? Which is not a classical, and not a classical in the same way. And
I'd
we'll
argue it
discuss
is.
why. But yeah, I'd love to hear that debate actually, because The
Well,
Hobbit by another J.R.R. There you go, J.R.R. as well, Tolkien. It's a book pre World War II. We really made a mark, I think, for kind of a few reasons. So it's mostly a children's or a kind of adolescent fantasy novel. I think many people in the Anglosphere have read it or are familiar with it, and mostly because of the movies, as you pointed out, for Lord of the Rings, which is arguably even more successful narrative from a also movie perspective. The Hobbit, which greedily was also turned into a trilogy, although it's a very thin book, very approachable for anyone that's tried reading it, is actually so the prequel to that, and it has this what is classical structure in the sense that it has this hero Bilbo Baggins, the original Hobbit, who lives in this realm where nothing happens, and he suffers from a series of they're quite short, so quite vulnerable, immature in many ways, like children, right? And I think that's
he lives in the realm that nothing happens. So is it Hungary, Eastern Europe? Where is it?
what is it called? I have a lapsus right
Middle
now.
Earth.
Middle Earth, right? But in particular, he's in the Shire, right? That's what I meant. The Shire is that part of Middle Earth where everybody's safe. It's all almost paradisiac, and effectively, to make a parallel to kind of the biblical story, he is throughout this journey kind of cast out of this paradisiac realm person, effectively of yeah, not of vice, but necessarily nothing, with no real competence, almost like a child in many ways. And he goes into a story, a journey of discovery and of self-discovery, makes friends and builds armies and fights dragons, the infamous Smaug, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
That's
uh,
the top three life goals I have. Have friends, build armies, and fight some dragons.
I
I've
I think
Yeah.
we should all attempt a form, a manifestation of that, even metaphorical.
Have you seen the movie?
Yeah,
The movies?
the movies. I think I've seen most of the movies. Yeah, I'm pretty
Most.
sure I have. I definitely read the Hobbit a few years back because my wife convinced me. It's one of her favorite books. Do you want me to argue Lord of the Rings versus Hobbit, or because I definitely
No, I'm just wondering because I know that Lord of the Rings the movie has a massive following, right?
mm,
But when The Hobbit came out in the theaters, many people were a bit like, it's not great. Which I don't really understand why, because I haven't watched them. So I'm not sure. Maybe I wanted to pick
uh,
your brain as to why or why wouldn't people like the movie.
well, Yeah, I think there's something about Lord of the Rings that really managed to do really well. That the Hobbit was almost a draft of an attempt, almost in the complexity of the characters. I think whereas the Hobbit kind of focuses on the hobbits, and the friends of Bilbo are all hobbits, and the Lord of the Rings, especially the character of Aragorn, really manages to build some very, very powerful human characters. The Fellowship of the Ring is a very, very complete archetypal construction that captures all sorts of features from various personality traits. Right, you've got the greedy dwarf, you've got and strong, you've got the nimble Apollonian sort of archman. I don't remember his name. And you've got the human, the king, which is Aragorn, and all of those things were extremely powerful because they tapped into very deep Jungian archetypes, if you will. And this is what I want to point out, and maybe this is the similarity that we'll get to in a moment. Is that all of this stuff? If you dive deeper into mythology, you discover that a lot of the stuff is actually covered by Carl Jung in his work, and from sort of the psychology of the archetypes, and what people like Tolkien did, and effectively then J.R.R. Martin as well. As an reinterpretation, they looked at the same source, right? In case of Tolkien, it was German philology, but obviously Carl Jung is of German, at least linguistic descent, and they all kind of borrowed from the synthesis that these guys did, and they were able to build extremely complex narratives by just reconfiguring the archetypes and giving them color. I'm not trying to demean what Tolkien did, but I'm just trying to say that the reason why these were extremely successful stories is that they are archetypal stories. They have a hero, Bilbo Baggins. They have the journey of the hero, the fight with the dragon, and then the return home, which is what Bilbo does in the end. A changed being in a way that is no longer greedy, doesn't really enjoy the wealth so much, but redistributes the wealth back to its collective hobbits, and that's what makes it kind of a classic, if you will. So
Brings it back home. Sounds
yeah,
like what English people say every single time they are about to win a
exactly.
football game.
Brings back the bacon and also
Brings back the bacon.
replenishes as it's called in psychological terms, kind of reactualizes the community, because the collective is a sum of individuals, and now you have one individual that has changed, that has matured and accomplished his
Mm.
potential in this, and this reactualizes and changes the structure of society back home, because now you've got a person that was kind of afraid, maybe full of vices, and now you've got a kind of a man in a way, from a archetypal point of view, brave, that's fought wars, that's defeated a dragon together with his friends, and that's amazing. Effectively, right? We are all inspired by that. Anyway,
So
I
it
wanted
sounds
to
like a very Dungeons and Dragons story, right? It's like you set
absolutely.
out, save the princess or save the day, save the kingdom, and defeat the bad guy, right?
I mean, what's not to love, right? That's what everybody wants to see
So
in all forms, right? And what changes is really the nature of the hero, right? There are other attributes, but otherwise, there's something really, really amazingly archetypal about this whole story that I want to point out.
The Hobbit sounds like a lot of fun. Although I do have to admit, I think Bilbo Baggins as a name is terrible. Like I think it's just such a ridiculously sounding name. But yeah,
Which I think
it's.
Frodo beats, by the way, right? That's why that's why Lord of the Rings beats trumps the Hobbit.
You mean Frodo is a better name or a worse
Yeah,
name?
better, well,
Oh,
arguably.
okay, okay. I thought you were like, oh, Frodo is even worse. Jesus Christ.
Look, they all have
Maybe
own names, clearly, like
maybe they're just
Normo and Razzo.
normal.
Uh,
Awesome,
all sound
awesome.
like
I love it.
bozos, right? Yeah.
Bozos. I guess George R.R. Martin himself has been a big fan of Tolkien, but say that he did what Tolkien has done in a different ways, maybe an exaggeration. He was a history writer, an alternative history writer. He took historical stories and kind of twisted them into a fantasy, right? And that's what Game of Thrones is. I mean, if I want to sum it up in 1 minute, right, I'd say Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the official title of the series, is a word of misspelled names, medieval hippies, packed with dragons, and titties. Right? That's sort of like sums up
What, even in
everything
the
that you need
book?
to know.
I
Even the
thought,
book, yeah.
okay, right. I
There,
always thought that the movie was exaggerating some of the feature of the original narrative, but no.
there are there are a lot of titties in the book, and
Okay.
essentially, I just read the prequel to the book as well, called Fire and Blood, which is more like a fake history recollection, and sometimes they quote the fools. You have the fools in the court, right, who just there to entertain the king, and the fools are often don't talk about anything but titties. That's all they do. They just keep cracking jokes about nudity and body tales, I guess. But overall, Game of Thrones is really a sword and sandals story that focuses on the drama of secession, right? Game of Thrones itself, the expression is a synonym for secession, right? When the king dies, who follows them, right?
Mm,
And the debate around that, right? And you see that across the board. It's basically everyone's always talks about who is the next king or who is the next queen and why they have the right or why they don't. And every conflict starts from there. And I think George himself is a bit too fond of the intrigue and the drama, right? He focuses a lot on what happens behind closed doors within the room. Actually, when you read the book, a lot of the cool stuff that you see in the show, like the dragon fights and the battles and all sort of stuff, is a bit underwhelming because he kind of just wraps it up. There's some interesting stuff, sure. Red wedding happens in the book as well, but it's different. It's not as intense. While the series really refocused on the action and stuff, which is a good thing.
right.
The book itself is more about talking about morals and intrigues and who is the right, who doesn't. And I guess the big charm of the book is it has a very point of view storytelling. So everything is told from the point of view of a person, how they see it. So if they don't see something, it's not being mentioned, right? And what also happens is that if there is like a story or an event told by different people, you often find contradictory stories. Like it's one person says X did X brought the beer, the other one says Y did or Z brought the beer. I
Right.
mean, these are minor things, but there's a lot of like small details there that's getting popped into the story,
Just to
and
make it a bit
that's
more ambiguous. It's kind of a nod to Faulkner, if I remember. As I said, Hobbit was written kind of between the wars, and you've got this omniscient narrator. But it reveals stuff gradually, of course. It doesn't tell you everything, but it's very much bird's eye view of what's happening, right? That's why you see the battles from a bird's eye perspective, as
sure.
you were saying. It's whereas this is kind of very much kind of stream of consciousness, not stream of consciousness, but definitely subjective first person narrative,
It is 100% first person narrative, and the
which
battles
is
themselves are told from first perspective as well. So
mm,
essentially you just see what happens around you. You have no idea what's going on the other side of the battlefield. So you see that as well, which is pretty cool. And I think generally the story, the themes in this book is all about, the horrors of war, the messiness of leadership, the corruption of the elites, and some incest. There's a lot of incest there among the cities. So but by and large, Game of Thrones, that which is the first book of the series, and the whole series itself, is nothing like an adventure story. I don't think anyone should treat it as an adventure
mm.
story or read it for adventure. It's more about political intrigue and drama
But I
with
mean,
some sword and sandal action.
I'm just curious what makes it, because I was talking about the motivation for reading and following, the trajectory of the main character, in this case Bilbo, as he ventures to into kind of this, to out of the Shire and so on, into a series of adventures against his will and so on, and you're curious what's going to happen next. What drives suspense and the desire to read more in a book that is effectively almost anthropological or sociological, right? To some extent. Or if I'm not.
Well, I mean, there's still a story, right? Every
Mm,
character has an arc. Everyone changes. One of the main characters, without trying to spoil too much, is is the son of the ruler, and he's kind
mm,
of exiled, and he gets into a bunch of trouble, and then he goes from really happy to incredibly depressed to being completely paranoid, and you see him and follow him through this change, and in the end you feel that he's a completely different person, and he
mm-hmm.
starts to do things that you wouldn't have expected him to do before. So it's almost like characterization of someone under stress.
Hmm.
And that's super interesting.
Are all arch from positive to negative? Because this is a big contrast, right, to what I was saying, which are kind of negative to positive, effectively, for most characters, most positive. Yeah, is
No,
everyone going through
no,
a positive arch, or does it
no.
fluctuate? Or
It fluctuates. If you've seen the show, you know some of the characters that will go through a negative
mm,
arch. There are plenty of positive arches as well as just arches that are just messy, like the Queen Cersei, if you remember her,
hmm,
and her motivation has always been a bit murky, as well as how she handles ruling and what she does and how she intrigues behind the court is I wouldn't necessarily describe it as positive or negative. It's just like she's kind of like the circumstances and how it drives her. So it's very much like down to earth, and I guess that's where a lot of the Hobbit comparison will clash, because I felt like with Hobbit, a lot of it was an adventure book where Gandalf appears sometimes to save the day. Other
of
than
course.
that, you kind of know like the good who are the good guys are, who the bad guys are, who's gonna win, which is cool, right? That's where like I think it's not even fair to compare the two books because it's just designed for different audiences,
Okay,
right?
let's just stop the podcast right now.
All
Not
right.
fair, as in,
Oh, oh,
if
oh,
it's not fair, stop it right now. No, I think you're
oh
right, but
no.
it's all kind of based on the same themes, right? You've got dragons, you've got, okay, mostly
They both
human
have dragons.
warriors, and that
Hmm.
was what was interesting about Game of Thrones, is with all the, and I haven't read the book, but I've seen a lot of episodes, the seasons, is that it was so weird because everything looked so human, right? Although the intrigue, and all of a sudden, dragons, all of a sudden, these northern creatures, right? Which, like, how can you even fight them? And I think maybe that's also a similarity with The Hobbit, because you have almost these humanoid creatures, hobbits or whatever, and then they're faced with these supernatural creatures that seem invincible, and yet
Yeah.
they manage to sometimes succeed in fighting them, which is, we're fascinated with that, I think, as humans, right?
Yeah, I guess the supernatural part of the story is the one where most people will have an issue with, because with Song of Ice and Fire, it's really a courtroom drama, or sorry, a throne room drama.
Mm,
So if you take the dragons out, it still actually kind of makes sense. Other than that, I guess the supernatural is really just there to demonstrate urgency. So the dragons themselves are often described as the nuclear weapons of Westeros, right? Whoever has the dragons is going to win, right? And then the White Walkers, the creatures you talk about, are essentially the coming danger that's inevitable, and you have to do
mm,
something about it, although most people don't even know what, right? And that's kind of like creates that counterbalance in politics where you can fuck around all day, to discuss like intrigue, drama, whatever policies you want as politician. By the end of the day, there's something coming that you have to prepare. And
mm,
it kind of shows how well or actually unwell the equipped are
mm-hmm.
to actually handle the
That
situation.
requires collaboration. It's kind of a call for human collaboration, right? In a sense, despite the small intrigue, right? When
Yeah,
you're faced
yeah.
with White
Ideally,
Walkers, you want to stand together.
ideally collaboration, but then everyone backstabs each other, right? So in the end of the day, everyone just wants their own little
Mm.
throne, own little power, own little domain in the story, and that makes it super sad, but also
Mm.
interesting because you
And
never know
and
what happens.
so it's kind of a reverse psychology, right? It is moralizing in a very, yeah, twisted way, because you see the consequences of not doing the right thing
Sure,
consistently.
sure, and I guess one of the charms of the story is, if you ever seen the movie or remember the first season, is that just because you're a good guy doesn't mean you won't die painfully, and people won't treat you unfairly. Like,
Uh, I think that's what made it so watchable, or so readable, right? Because you stand with these amazing guys, right? The archetypes of the hero, and then all of a
mm,
sudden, they get the worst. You expect them to succeed, and you're rooting for them
well,
as they get
mm,
kind of decapitated or worse, right?
or
If we can say,
punished for some
yeah,
reason.
punished in a very, very horrible ways. And we're fascinated with understanding the root of evil, right? I think in that point, why, they've been doing all the right things. If you've read The Hobbit, you know what are the right things, and yet seems like the narrator, the author, is wants to prove out what happens sometimes in real world as a result of evil. and
Mm.
yeah, it definitely gets our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess they both of these books deal with how humans handle evil, or how the good
Mm.
guys handle evil, and how it either corrupts them or changes them at
Mhm.
least. I'd recommend everyone to read both of them because they both sound really fun. I do want to add that Hobbit seems to be a short book, but like I read the Wikipedia page and there's just so much going on. I'm surprised
Mm.
like he managed to wrap it up in like a few hundred pages.
Yeah, and I don't know why the Game of Thrones is so big to some extent because and maybe this is just down
It's
to
fucking huge.
writing style. Ultimately, all of these things can be, if you can summarize it in a Wikipedia page, you can probably expand it as much as you want. And then it's almost down to the talent, clearly Tolkien's talent of being extremely synthetic and simplifying things, simplifying characters, events, boiling them down to their essential structure so that it's extremely readable and extremely exciting without being cumbersome. But it's also credit to Martin because he's able to expand that. And he spends a lot of time kind of building it up. Although it's very clear what needs to happen, right? If you could boil down things to quite essential narratives.
Yeah, I guess they used to say like Tolkien created his own language to support the story, or other way around. I don't really know.
Mm.
Martin just likes to talk about food most of the times. I have the impression when you read the book, like almost every chapter or every second chapter has like a dinner in it or like a
Mm.
lunch, and they
He's
just
quite a plump guy, isn't
describe.
he? As well, he clearly
Oh yeah, he's
enjoys
well fed,
enjoys.
but
I'm wondering if he's writing this in the south of France or somewhere.
he
Taste.
he describes everything. What they drink, what's the main meal, what's the dessert, how it looks, how it feels, what it tastes like. I feel like the word turnip, the word cured ham, probably appears more times than some character names. There is a whole chapter, and I kid you not, probably like 10 pages long. Well, the chapter is longer, but they probably dedicate 10 pages to going through the storage and describing what every single shelf has.
Oh my god.
And he's not like there's nothing unique there. It's just stuff that you would expect. As I said, turnips, cured ham, and it just goes into painful level of detail. And
Okay.
I get it. I actually get it because the point of that chapter is to show how well equipped the castle is for the siege, which later happens, right? And it basically talks about how they start to starve, how they have no food, how they, suffering.
Mm.
So it builds it up. It's just feels a bit overzealous.
He's creating form of tension, right, with that because you're clearly that bores you to death reading those pages, and yet all of a sudden that's relevant, isn't it? And that's also
Yeah.
you feel that in the Game of Thrones as well because they're appear in the movies. I mean, in the series, they're just moments of dead moments. Nothing happens, but you're under fear. You've already been traumatized from previous events. You expect anything to happen, and yet he goes on in these enumerations. And that's probably maybe the merit of enumeration that Hobbit doesn't have, building of, just enumerating things over and over again, and you're feeling things that have nothing to do with what he's talking about. It allows you the time to recollect yourself after previous events and dread what's about to come, which is
Yeah.
effectively another layer that is quite fascinating.
Brilliant. I enjoy it. That sounds great.
Okay, well, awesome. Yeah, we definitely encourage everyone to start with The Hobbit, especially if you're younger, and then as
If
you
yeah.
if you're ready, under parental guidance or as an adult, go for the big dog of Ice and Fire.
If you wanna finger rings, then it's Hobbit. If you wanna finger something else, then it's Game of Thrones. Honestly, I recommend reading it. It is tedious a little bit, but I think it pays off. Like I remember finishing the 5,000 something pages of the whole series, and it hasn't ended yet, so it's still counting. But I finished it, and there wasn't a day when I was like, "Yeah, that book was awesome."
Hmm.
It's just maybe I just tell myself because I suffered through it, and I have to justify why I spent so much fucking time reading it. I'm unsure,
That's
but I enjoyed it.
I think maybe that's the some of the purpose of reading. That's why we're still talking about books. Is this experience that you don't get with a movie, right? It's the feeling that
Absolutely,
you're earning something through the process. Stick through it. Is and the
absolutely.
journey is as important as the end. Hope you enjoy it.
Absolutely. That wraps up our story for this week. Thank you for joining in. And next week, we talk about something else. Bye bye.
Stick around. Yeah.
Stick around.
Enjoy it.